The mountain wind howled through the pines as Patricia Jones pressed her back against the rough cabin wall, her swollen belly straining against the thin fabric of her worn dress. 8 months pregnant and nowhere to run, she could hear the angry voices of the men approaching through the trees. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she clutched the letter that had brought her to this remote wilderness, the paper now crumpled and damp with her tears. "She's in there somewhere," a harsh voice called out through the darkness. No pregnant woman could get far in this terrain, especially not in her condition. The tracks lead right to this cabin. Patricia closed her eyes, feeling the baby kick restlessly inside her as if sensing her terror. The child had been unusually active today, responding to her elevated heartbeat and the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had come so far, traveled so many miles on faith alone, enduring weeks of uncomfortable train rides and bone-jarring stagecoach journeys, only to find herself trapped between the life she'd fled and the uncertain future that awaited her. The cabin behind her remained silent, its owner nowhere to be seen, and she wondered if Ryan Myers, the mountain man who had agreed to marry her sight unseen, would even care what happened to her now. Would he turn her over to these men to save himself trouble? Would he demand an explanation she wasn't prepared to give? The sound of boots crunching on fallen leaves grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather holsters. Patricia knew her time was running out. She had to make a choice, had to decide whether to trust the stranger whose rough hands had built this shelter in the wilderness, or face the men who had tracked her across 3 states with vengeance in their hearts and violence in their intentions. "Check around back," another voice commanded. "She might be hiding in the barn or the root cellar. Tom, you watch the front. If she tries to run, bring her down, but don't kill her. The boss wants her alive." 3 months earlier, Patricia had been a different woman entirely. She had stood in the cramped boarding house room in Chicago, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. The morning light streaming through the grimy window revealed the dark circles under her eyes and the pallor of her skin. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, unwashed for days because the very smell of soap made her stomach revolt. Her hands trembled as she smoothed them over her still flat stomach, though she knew that wouldn't last much longer. The morning sickness had been getting worse, striking at all hours of the day and night. She had been forced to leave her job at the textile factory when she could no longer hide her frequent rushes to the privy, and her savings were dwindling rapidly. The other women in the boarding house had begun to whisper and stare, their judgment clear in their cold glances and pointed silences. The letter from her sister lay open on the narrow bed behind her, its contents burned into her memory. Carolyn had written from her own homestead in Oregon Territory, her words carrying the bluntness that had always characterized their relationship. "You need to get out of that city before it kills you," Carolyn had written in her careful script. "The opportunities out here are real, Patricia. Men are desperate for wives, and most of them don't ask too many questions about a woman's past. Find yourself a good man who'll treat you decent and don't look back. There's nothing left for you in Chicago but shame and poverty." Patricia had spent weeks reading the matrimonial advertisements in various newspapers, her heart sinking as she read requirement after requirement that she couldn't meet. Most of the men wanted young, virtuous women who could bear them children and keep house without complaint. They wanted references from pastors and family members, proof of good character and moral standing. They wanted everything she couldn't provide. She had almost given up hope when she found Ryan Myers' advertisement in a Montana Territory newspaper, tucked between notices for mining equipment and livestock sales. The wording had been different from the others, less demanding and more pragmatic. Seeking wife for Mountain Homestead must be strong, practical, and willing to work hard. Age and appearance less important than character and determination. No questions asked about past circumstances. Write to R. Myers, Bear Creek Trading Post, Montana Territory. The phrase "no questions asked" had caught her attention immediately, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She had written to him that very evening, her hands shaking as she composed the letter by candlelight. She told him she was 24 years old, healthy despite her current circumstances, and willing to work harder than any woman he might find. She mentioned that she could cook and sew, that she had experience managing a household budget, and that she wasn't afraid of hard work or isolation. She painted herself as a practical choice, a woman who would be a partner rather than a burden. What she didn't mention was the baby growing inside her, or the reason she needed to leave Chicago so desperately. She didn't write about Marcus Brennan, the factory foreman with his wandering hands and his threats, or about the night he had cornered her in the empty factory after her shift had ended. She didn't mention his promises of advancement if she was friendly, or his threats of unemployment, and worse if she wasn't. She certainly didn't write about his rage when she had tried to resist, or about the brutal way he had taken what he wanted, regardless of her protests. His reply had come faster than she'd expected, written in a bold, careful hand on rough paper that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. He had accepted her proposal without reservation and enclosed money for the train fare, along with detailed instructions for reaching his homestead. "The journey is long and difficult," he had written. "Make sure you're certain about this decision before you start. There's no easy way back once you're here. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, and neither does the wilderness. But if you're truly willing to work and build a life here, you'll find a home and a husband who'll treat you with respect. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." Patricia had read the letter dozens of times, searching for hidden meanings or signs of deception. But the words seemed genuine, written by a man who understood hardship and wasn't looking for fairy tale romance. He wanted a partner, someone who could share the burden of survival in an unforgiving landscape. It wasn't love, but it might be safety, and that was more than she dared hope for. She had packed her few belongings into a single carpet bag, leaving behind everything that connected her to her old life. The few dresses that still fit, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the small amount of money she had managed to save. She left Chicago on the morning train, watching the city disappear behind her with a mixture of relief and terror. The crowded tenements and smoking factories gave way to farmland and open sky, and with each mile, she felt the weight of her past beginning to lift. The journey west had been grueling, made worse by her advancing pregnancy and the constant fear that someone might recognize her and send word back to those she was fleeing. Marcus Brennan had powerful friends in the city, men who owed him favors and wouldn't hesitate to help him track down a runaway factory girl. She had changed trains in Denver, then again in a smaller town whose name she couldn't even remember. Each transfer bringing new anxiety about discovery and pursuit. Each mile took her further from civilization and deeper into a landscape that seemed both beautiful and threatening. The mountains rose around her like sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow even in late summer. The air grew thinner and cleaner, so different from the smoky atmosphere of Chicago that it made her dizzy at first. Fellow passengers spoke of Indian raids and wild animals, of harsh winters that could kill the unprepared and isolation that drove some people mad. The final leg of her journey had been by stagecoach, a bone-jarring ride over rough mountain roads that left her exhausted and sick. The other passengers had eyed her with curiosity and suspicion, clearly wondering what would bring a pregnant woman alone to such remote country. A traveling salesman had tried to engage her in conversation, his questions becoming increasingly personal until she had retreated into silence. An elderly woman had offered unsolicited advice about traveling in her condition, her tone carrying disapproval and judgment that Patricia had learned to ignore. She had kept to herself, speaking only when necessary and avoiding their probing questions. The landscape outside the stagecoach window had grown wilder and more dramatic with each passing hour. Vast expanses of wilderness broken only by occasional mining camps or isolated homesteads. She had wondered what kind of man would choose to live in such isolation. What had driven Ryan Myers to seek a wife through correspondence rather than finding one in the settled communities of the East? The trading post at Bear Creek had been little more than a collection of rough buildings clustered around a muddy main street. Weathered wooden structures leaned against each other for support, their paint long since stripped away by wind and weather. Patricia had climbed down from the stagecoach with her legs shaking, partly from the difficult journey and partly from nerves about meeting the man who was to become her husband. The thin mountain air had made her lightheaded, and she had to grip the side of the coach to steady herself. She had expected Ryan Myers to be waiting for her, perhaps holding a sign with her name or scanning the arriving passengers with the same anxiety she felt. Instead, the trading post owner, a grizzled man named Scott Alvarez, had greeted her with a knowing look that suggested he had experience with nervous mail-order brides. "You must be the bride," he had said, looking her up and down with sharp eyes that missed nothing, including her obvious pregnancy. His weathered face had shown no surprise or judgment, only a practical assessment of her condition. "Ryan's up at his place getting things ready for your arrival. I'm to take you up there when you're ready to travel again, but I'd recommend you rest a spell first. That last stretch is rough even for folks who aren't carrying extra cargo." Patricia had felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at his frank acknowledgement of her pregnancy, but there had been no condemnation in his voice, only the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had seen all manner of human circumstances. She had spent the night in the Trading Post's small guest room, a cramped space with thin walls that did little to muffle the sounds from the saloon next door. She had lain awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness. Wolves howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling in haunting harmonies that spoke of wildness and freedom. The wind through the pines created an eerie symphony that seemed to whisper of isolation and danger, but also of possibilities she had never imagined. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, Ryan Myers was waiting for her, a man she had never seen but who had already shown her more kindness than anyone in Chicago ever had. The next morning, Scott had loaded her carpet bag into a sturdy wagon and helped her climb onto the hard wooden seat. His horses were mountain-bred, sturdy animals with intelligent eyes and sure footing. "These roads ain't much more than deer paths in some places," he had warned as they set out. "But don't worry, these horses know every rock and route between here and Ryan's place." The ride to Ryan's homestead had taken most of the day, following a narrow trail that wound through dense forest and across rushing streams that sparkled like diamonds in the dappled sunlight. Patricia had gripped the wagon seat with white knuckles as they navigated the treacherous path, certain that one wrong turn would send them tumbling down the mountainside into the rocky gorges below. Ancient pines towered overhead, their trunks so massive that it would take several people holding hands to encircle them. Wildflowers bloomed in hidden meadows, painting the landscape in brilliant colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Eagles soared overhead, riding the mountain thermals with effortless grace, and once she glimpsed a deer watching them from the shadows of the forest before bounding away in graceful leaps. "Ryan's a good man," Scott had said during one of their brief stops to rest the horses and allow Patricia to stretch her aching back. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he's honest and hardworking. Built that cabin with his own hands, cleared the land tree by tree, put in a garden that produces enough to feed half the valley. He'll treat you fair if you're willing to do your part." What happened to his first wife? Patricia had asked, the question that had been nagging at her since she'd first read his advertisement. No man sought a mail-order bride without a reason, and she needed to understand what she was walking into. Scott's expression had grown somber, his weathered hands tightening on the reins. "Died in childbirth 3 winters ago, her and the baby both. Near broke him, I think. Sarah was a sweet girl, came out from Pennsylvania full of dreams about frontier life. She wasn't quite prepared for how hard it could be up here, especially when winter sets in and you're cut off from everything for months at a time." He had paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. He's been alone up there ever since, just him in the mountains. Some folks thought he might give up, maybe head back east or at least move down to town. But he stayed, kept working, kept building. "I think he needs someone to share the load, someone who understands that life up here ain't easy, but it's good if you're willing to work for it." The information had filled Patricia with a complex mixture of sympathy and fear. She understood loss, understood the kind of grief that could drive a person to seek solitude in the wilderness. Her own losses had been different, but no less painful. The death of her parents, the destruction of her reputation, the shattering of her dreams for a respectable life. But she also worried about what kind of reception she would receive from a man still mourning his first wife and child. Would he see her as a replacement, a poor substitute for the woman he had truly loved? Would he resent her pregnancy, a constant reminder that she carried another man's child? When they had finally reached the homestead, Patricia's first impression had been one of surprised admiration. The cabin was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with careful attention to detail that spoke of skill and patience. A stone chimney rose from one end, and real glass windows caught the afternoon sunlight like jewels. The structure seemed to grow naturally from the landscape, as if it had always been part of this mountain meadow. A vegetable garden flourished behind a sturdy fence designed to keep out deer and other wildlife. Patricia could see rows of corn, beans, and squash, along with herbs and root vegetables that would provide sustenance through the long winter months. A barn and several outbuildings spoke of careful planning and hard work, of a man who understood what it took to survive in this challenging environment. Ryan Myers had emerged from the cabin as their wagon approached, and Patricia's breath had caught in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of hard physical labor. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in the city, and his full beard couldn't hide the strong lines of his face or the intelligence in his dark eyes. His clothes were rough but clean, practical garments suited to his environment, and his hands, she noticed as he helped her down from the wagon, were calloused but gentle. "Mrs. Jones," he had said formally, his voice deep and carefully controlled. There was something in his tone that suggested he was as nervous as she was, though he hid it better. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult for you." "Please, call me Patricia," she had replied, studying his face for any sign of reaction to her obvious pregnancy. She had braced herself for shock, disgust, or anger, but his dark eyes had taken in her condition without expression, as if he had been expecting it. But instead of turning her away or demanding explanations, Ryan had simply nodded and picked up her carpet bag as if it weighed nothing. "You must be tired," he had said, his tone gentle. "Come inside and rest. We can talk later when you've had a chance to recover from your travels." The interior of the cabin had been a revelation that challenged every assumption she had made about frontier living. The main room was spacious and well-furnished, with a large stone fireplace that dominated one wall and handmade furniture that showed both skill and artistry. A ladder led to a loft area that appeared to serve as sleeping quarters, and Patricia could see a separate bedroom through an open doorway. Everything was clean and orderly, clearly the work of a man who took pride in his home and understood the importance of comfort in an isolated environment. Shelves lined the walls, filled with more books than Patricia had expected to find in such a remote location. She could see volumes on agriculture, medicine, engineering, and literature, suggesting a man of education and broad interests. A writing desk sat near one of the windows, positioned to take advantage of the natural light, and she noticed papers covered with careful handwriting and detailed drawings. "I've prepared the bedroom for you," Ryan had said, setting her bag down near the door. His manner was formal but kind, like a gentleman welcoming a guest rather than a husband claiming his bride. "I'll sleep in the loft until we're properly married. The preacher comes through once a month, but if you'd prefer to wait and get to know each other first, that's fine too." Patricia had stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "You're not angry about the baby?" Ryan's expression had softened slightly, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of the pain he carried beneath his controlled exterior. "A child is a blem, no matter the circumstances that brought it into being. If you're willing to be a mother to this baby and a wife to me, then we'll make it work. I've learned that life is too short and too precious to waste on anger over things that can't be changed." That first evening, they had sat by the fire and talked quietly about practical matters, carefully avoiding the emotional depths that lay beneath their arrangement. Ryan had explained the rhythms of life on the mountain, the seasonal cycles that governed everything from planting to harvesting to the long months of winter isolation. He spoke of the challenges they would face, the constant vigilance required to protect their livestock from predators, the need to preserve and store enough food to last through months when travel was impossible. Patricia had listened carefully, asking questions and trying to understand what would be expected of her. She had experience with household management, but nothing had prepared her for the self-sufficiency required in this environment. Every aspect of daily life required planning and preparation, from the soap they used to the candles that provided light after darkness fell. "I should tell you about my past," she had said finally, her hands folded in her lap as she gathered courage for the confession she dreaded. "About why I needed to leave Chicago, about the baby's father." Ryan had studied her face in the firelight, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Only if you want to. Sometimes the past is better left buried, especially when it can't be changed. What matters to me is who you are now and who you want to become. But Patricia had felt compelled to share at least part of her story, to give him the truth he deserved before they went any further with their arrangement. She told him about working in the textile factory, about the long hours and dangerous conditions that were considered normal for women in her position. She spoke about Marcus Brennan, the foreman who had used his position to exploit vulnerable workers, though she couldn't bring herself to describe the worst of what had happened. The baby's father, she had said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He's not a good man. He has powerful friends in Chicago, and he made it clear that if I stayed, he would make sure I lost everything. I was afraid of what he might do to me or to the baby once it was born. He's the kind of man who sees people as possessions, things to be used and discarded when they're no longer useful. Ryan had listened without judgment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished speaking, he had been quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking wisdom in the flames. "You're safe here," he had said simply, his voice carrying a conviction that made her want to weep with relief. "No one will hurt you or your child while you're under my protection. This mountain doesn't care about Chicago politics or powerful friends. Out here, a man's worth is measured by his actions, not at his connections." The wedding had taken place 2 weeks later, when the circuit preacher had arrived at the trading post for his monthly visit. Patricia had worn her best dress, a blue cotton gown that she had carefully altered to accommodate her growing belly, and Ryan had appeared in a clean white shirt and his only suit, a well-made garment that suggested he hadn't always been a mountain man. The ceremony had been brief and practical, witnessed by Scott Alvarez and a few other locals who had gathered for the occasion. The preacher, a weathered man named Reverend Thompson, who had been serving the mountain communities for over a decade, had spoken about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment in the face of adversity. As they had exchanged vows, Patricia had felt a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. The words were familiar, the same promises that countless couples had made throughout history, but their circumstances were anything but ordinary. Ryan Myers was nothing like what she had expected from his terse advertisement. He was educated, well-read, and possessed of a quiet dignity that commanded respect from everyone who knew him. But he was also reserved, careful with his words and emotions, and she wondered if she would ever truly know the man she had married. "Do you, Patricia Jones, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind that whistled through the gaps in the trading post walls. "Do you, Ryan Myers, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Ryan had replied, his voice strong and clear, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. After the ceremony, there had been a simple celebration with cake and coffee, the other attendees offering congratulations and advice with the easy familiarity of a small community. Scott Alvarez had pulled Ryan aside for a quiet conversation, while several of the women had approached Patricia with offers of help and friendship that suggested she might find acceptance here that had been denied to her in Chicago. Their early weeks together had established a pattern of cautious cooperation that gradually warmed into something approaching friendship. Ryan treated her with unfailing courtesy and respect, helping her with heavy tasks and making sure she had everything she needed for her comfort and health. He had even begun construction on a cradle, working on it in the evenings by lamplight, with the careful precision of a craftsman who understood that every detail mattered. Patricia had thrown herself into the work of maintaining their household, determined to prove her worth as a wife and partner. She had taken over the cooking and cleaning, learning to manage the wood-burning stove and adapt her city recipes to the ingredients available in their mountain environment. She had tended the vegetable garden, learning to identify and combat the pests and diseases that threatened their food supply, and had begun learning to preserve food for the coming winter months. The physical work had been challenging in her condition, but she had persevered, driven by a need to earn her place in this new life. Every task completed successfully, Every meal that earned Ryan's quiet approval, every small improvement she made to their home felt like a victory against the shame and failure that had driven her from Chicago. As autumn had deepened into winter, their relationship had gradually warmed beyond mere cooperation. They had developed a comfortable routine of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire, during which Ryan had begun reading aloud from his extensive collection of books. His voice was perfect for the task, deep and expressive, bringing life to the words of Shakespeare, Dickens, and other authors Patricia had only heard about in passing. "You have a beautiful reading voice," she had told him one evening as he closed a volume of poetry. "Did you ever consider teaching?" Ryan had smiled, a rare expression that transformed his serious features. "I was a teacher, actually. Back in Pennsylvania before I came west, I taught in a one-room schoolhouse, children of all ages learning together. It was good work, meaningful work." "What made you leave?" Patricia had asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw the shadow that crossed his face. "Sarah wanted adventure," he had said quietly. "She had read stories about the frontier, about the opportunities available to those brave enough to claim them. She convinced me that we could build something special out here, something that would last for generations. And we did, for a while." The pain in his voice had been unmistakable, and Patricia had felt a stab of sympathy for this man who had lost so much. She had reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers in a gesture of comfort that surprised them both. "I'm sorry," she had whispered. "I can't imagine how difficult it must have been." Ryan had looked down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. "It was, but life goes on, and we have to find reasons to keep living. You and the baby, you've given me something to look forward to again." One evening in late October, as the first snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that caught the lamplight like tiny stars, Patricia had felt the baby's movements become more urgent and frequent. She had been sitting by the fire, mending one of Ryan's shirts with careful stitches, when a sharp pain had shot through her back and around her swollen belly. The sensation had been unlike anything she had experienced before, a tightening that seemed to squeeze her entire midsection with relentless pressure. She had gasped, dropping the shirt and pressing her hands to her belly as another contraction gripped her body. "Ryan," she had called, trying to keep the alarm out of her voice but failing completely. "I think it might be time." He had been at her side immediately, his calm presence steadying her as another contraction gripped her body with increasing intensity. His hands had been gentle as he helped her to stand, supporting her weight as she struggled to breathe through the pain. "It's early," he had said, his voice steady despite the concern she could see in his eyes. "But not dangerously so. First babies often come when they're ready, not when we expect them. I'll ride down to the trading post and fetch the midwife." "Don't leave me," Patricia had whispered, fear overwhelming her as she realized she was about to face the ordeal of childbirth alone in the wilderness, miles from any doctor or hospital. "Please, I can't do this alone." "You won't be alone," Ryan had promised, his voice firm with conviction that helped calm her racing heart. "I won't leave you, Patricia. I helped deliver calves and foals, and I've read every medical book I could find. We can do this together." The next 12 hours had been the longest of Patricia's life, a blur of pain and exhaustion punctuated by moments of terror when she was certain something was going wrong. The contractions had come in waves, each one more intense than the last. And she had clung to Ryan's hands as he coached her through each surge of agony. He had been patient and encouraging, never once showing fear or doubt even when complications had arisen and the baby's position had made delivery difficult. "You're doing beautifully," he had murmured during one particularly difficult contraction, his voice a lifeline in the storm of pain. "The baby's almost here, Patricia. Just a little longer." The baby had been born just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to herald the arrival of new life. Christopher had emerged into the world with strong lungs and an indignant cry that filled the cabin with the most beautiful sound Patricia had ever heard. Ryan had caught him expertly, his large hands gentle as he cleared the baby's airway and wrapped him in soft blankets. "He's perfect," Ryan had said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the infant in Patricia's arms. "Absolutely perfect." Patricia had wept as she looked down at her son, overwhelmed by relief and joy, and a love so fierce it took her breath away. Christopher was beautiful, with a cap of dark hair and tiny features that seemed to shift between her own and some unknown combination of genetics that would reveal itself as he grew. "What will you name him?" Ryan had asked, his finger gently stroking the baby's cheek. Patricia had looked up at her husband, this good man who had given her sanctuary and safety, who had helped bring her child safely into the world without judgment or reservation. The decision came easily, born of gratitude and hope for the future. "Christopher," she had said firmly, "Christopher Myers." Ryan's eyes had filled with tears, and for the first time since she had known him, his careful composure had cracked completely. "You would give him my name?" "He's your son now," Patricia had replied, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "In every way that matters. You're the man who will raise him, who will teach him right from wrong, who will be there for every milestone and every challenge. Biology doesn't make a father, Ryan. Love does." The weeks following Christopher's birth had transformed their relationship in ways Patricia had never expected. Ryan had proven to be a devoted father, taking turns with night feedings and diaper changes, singing lullabies in his deep, gentle voice, and spending hours simply watching the baby sleep with an expression of wonder that never seemed to fade. The love he showed for Christopher had gradually extended to Patricia as well, expressed through small kindnesses and moments of unexpected tenderness that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere obligation. He brought her wildflowers from the mountain meadows, made her favorite tea when she was tired from nursing, and began to share stories of his own childhood and dreams for their family's future. Winter had closed in around their mountain homestead with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled higher than the windows and temperatures that made venturing outside dangerous without proper preparation. But inside their warm cabin, with the baby growing stronger each day and their marriage deepening into something real and precious, Patricia had found a contentment she had never thought possible. The isolation that might have driven some people to despair had become a blessing, giving them time to learn each other's rhythms and build the foundation of trust and affection that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. They had been forced to rely entirely on each other, and in doing so had discovered that they were stronger together than either had been alone. It was during a brief thaw in February that their peaceful existence had been shattered like glass struck by a hammer. Patricia had been nursing Christopher by the fire, enjoying the quiet contentment of the moment, when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the snow. The sound was wrong somehow, too purposeful and aggressive for casual travelers or neighbors making a social call. Ryan had gone to the window immediately, his expression growing grim as he watched the riders approach. His hand had moved instinctively to the rifle that hung above the fireplace, a gesture that told Patricia everything she needed to know about the nature of their visitors. "3 men," he had said quietly, his voice carefully controlled but tense with alertness. "Armed and riding hard. They don't look like they're here for a social visit." Patricia's blood had run cold as she recognized the description, her worst fears crystallizing into terrifying reality. "They found me," she had whispered, clutching Christopher protectively against her chest. "I don't know how, but they found me." She had known this day might come, had lived with the fear of it through every peaceful moment of the past months. Marcus Brennan was not a man who accepted defiance, and his reach extended far beyond the boundaries of Chicago. He had the resources and connections to track down one runaway factory girl, no matter how far she had fled. The men had dismounted and approached the cabin with the confident swagger of those accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and violence. Their leader, a well-dressed man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth that Patricia recognized with a surge of terror, had pounded on the door with his fist. "Open up!" Marcus Brennan had shouted, his voice carrying the same arrogant authority that had made her life hell in Chicago. "We know you're in there, Patricia. Time to come home and face the consequences of your actions." Ryan had positioned himself between Patricia and the door, his rifle in his hands and his stance that of a man prepared to fight. "My wife isn't going anywhere," he had called back, his voice steady despite the tension she could see in every line of his body. "You're trespassing on private property. I suggest you leave before there's trouble." "Your wife?" Marcus's laughter had been harsh and mocking, filled with the contempt he had always shown for anyone he considered beneath his station. That whore isn't anybody's wife. She's carrying my bastard child, and she stole money from me when she ran. I'm here to take back what's mine. The baby is mine, Ryan had replied firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that made Patricia's heart swell with gratitude and love. And so is my wife. You have no claim here. The confrontation had escalated quickly from there, words giving way to threats and threats to action. The men had tried to force their way into the cabin, and Ryan had been forced to fire a warning shot to drive them back. The sound of the rifle had been deafening in the confined space, and Christopher had begun crying, his infant senses detecting the danger that surrounded them. But Patricia had known they wouldn't give up easily. These were not men who accepted defeat gracefully, and Marcus Brennan in particular was not someone who would walk away from a challenge to his authority. They'll wait us out, she had told Ryan as they barricaded themselves inside, using furniture to block the windows and door. Or they'll try to burn us out. They won't leave without me, and they won't care who gets hurt in the process. Then they'll leave disappointed, Ryan had said grimly, checking his ammunition and preparing for a siege. I meant what I said in our wedding vows, Patricia. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, no one is taking you or Christopher away from me. The siege had lasted 3 days. 3 days of terror and exhaustion that tested every aspect of their relationship and their will to survive. The men had taken shelter in Ryan's barn, confident that hunger and cold would eventually force their quarry to surrender. They had made several attempts to storm the cabin, each one repelled by Ryan's accurate rifle fire. But Patricia had known their ammunition was limited and their food supplies were running low. The attackers had tried psychological warfare as well, shouting threats and promises alternately. Marcus had described in graphic detail what he planned to do to Patricia when he got his hands on her, while his companions had offered Ryan money to simply hand her over and avoid further conflict. You don't know what you're protecting, one of them had called out during the second night. She's nothing but a factory whore who spread her legs for the boss and then tried to blackmail him. Give her up and we'll leave you in peace. But Ryan had remained unmoved by their arguments and threats, his loyalty to Patricia and Christopher absolute and unshakable. He had taken careful shots only when necessary, conserving ammunition while making it clear that any attempt to approach the cabin would be met with deadly force. On the third night, as Christopher slept peacefully in his cradle, despite the chaos surrounding him, Patricia had made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just months earlier. She had loaded Ryan's spare rifle with hands that shook only slightly and taken position at one of the windows. I won't let them destroy what we've built, she had told her husband, her voice steady with newfound determination. This is my fight too, and I won't hide behind you while they try to tear apart our family. Ryan had looked at her with an expression of pride and love that had given her strength she didn't know she possessed. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Patricia had replied, checking the rifle's action with movements Ryan had taught her during their quiet winter evenings. They want to take me back to a life of fear and shame, but I'm not that woman anymore. I'm Patricia Myers, and this is my home. When the men had made their final assault at dawn, they had found themselves facing not just one defender, but two. Patricia had discovered a strength and determination she had never known she possessed, fighting not just for her own freedom, but for the family she had found in this remote mountain sanctuary and the life she had built from nothing but hope and hard work. The battle had been brief but decisive, lasting only minutes, but feeling like hours to those involved. When the smoke had cleared and the echoes of gunfire had faded into the mountain silence, two of the men lay dead in the snow, their blood staining the pristine white with crimson proof of their failed mission. Marcus Brennan himself had fled into the wilderness, wounded and defeated, his arrogance finally broken by the realization that Patricia Jones was no longer the frightened factory girl he had once terrorized. She had found something worth fighting for, and people willing to fight beside her, and that had made all the difference. Patricia had stood in the doorway of her home, her baby in her arms and her husband at her side, and felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was free, truly free, for the first time since childhood, and the feeling was more intoxicating than she had ever imagined possible. Spring had come early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and hope that seemed to permeate every aspect of their lives like sunlight after a long, dark winter. The snow had melted to reveal the first green shoots of new growth pushing through the rich mountain soil. And Patricia had worked alongside Ryan to plant an expanded garden and make improvements to their homestead that would serve them for years to come. They had added a chicken coop and acquired a small flock of hens that would provide fresh eggs year-round, along with meat when needed. Ryan had also purchased several young pigs from a neighbor down the valley, animals that would help clear brush from areas they wanted to cultivate while providing bacon and ham for their table. Christopher had grown strong and healthy, his laughter filling the cabin with joy and his bright eyes following his parents' every movement with the intense curiosity of a child discovering the world. He had begun to crawl, exploring every corner of their home with the fearless determination that seemed to characterize the Myers family. The threat from Patricia's past had been eliminated, but the experience had bonded her and Ryan in ways that mere proximity and shared responsibilities never could have. They had fought side by side to protect their family, had faced death together and emerged victorious, and in doing so had discovered depths of love and commitment that surprised them both. "I never expected this," Patricia had confessed one evening as they sat on the porch Ryan had built that spring, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Christopher slept peacefully in her arms, his tiny fist curled around her finger in the trusting grip that never failed to move her to tears. "Expected what?" Ryan had asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders as a cool mountain breeze stirred the pines around their cabin. "To be happy," she had replied simply, the words carrying the weight of all the pain and fear she had left behind. "To feel like I belong somewhere, like I'm part of something bigger than myself. I came here running from my past, but I found my future instead." Ryan had turned to look at her, his dark eyes soft with emotion that he no longer tried to hide. The reserved, careful man she had married had gradually revealed depths of feeling and tenderness that took her breath away. "I thought I was done with happiness after Sarah died," he had admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Thought the best I could hope for was to get through each day without falling apart completely. But you and Christopher, you've given me something I never thought I'd have again." "What's that?" "A reason to look forward instead of back. A future worth building instead of a past worth mourning." Their second summer together had been a time of growth and prosperity that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The garden had produced abundantly, yielding more vegetables than they could consume fresh, and requiring extensive preservation efforts for the winter months ahead. Patricia had learned to can and dry produce, to smoke meat and make cheese, skills that would ensure their family's survival and comfort through the harsh mountain winters. Ryan had expanded his small herd of cattle with the help of neighbors from down the valley, men who had come to respect his knowledge and work ethic. The mountain community was small and interdependent, and Ryan's reputation as a fair dealer and reliable neighbor had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to newcomers. Patricia had established herself as a skilled seamstress, taking in work from other families in the area and contributing to their household income in ways that made her feel like a true partner in their enterprise. Her delicate stitching and eye for detail had quickly gained her a reputation that brought customers from as far away as Denver, women willing to pay premium prices for quality work. But perhaps more importantly, she had found her place in the small community of mountain families that formed the backbone of their isolated society. The women had initially been suspicious of the newcomer with the mysterious past and the baby born suspiciously soon after her marriage. But Patricia's courage during the siege and her obvious devotion to her family had won their respect and acceptance. She had helped deliver babies, her experience with Christopher, and her steady nerves making her a valuable assistant to the area's overworked midwife. She had nursed the sick through fevers and injuries, had provided comfort to those grieving losses, and had gradually built the network of friendships and support that made life in the wilderness not just bearable but fulfilling. As Christopher had grown from infant to toddler, his resemblance to Patricia had become more pronounced, but Ryan had never treated him as anything other than his own son. He had taught the boy to walk, holding his small hands and encouraging his first tentative steps across the cabin floor. He had carved him toys from scraps of wood, creating horses and soldiers and animals that sparked the child's imagination. Most importantly, he had spent countless hours reading to him from the collection of books that lined their cabin walls, his deep voice bringing stories to life in ways that captivated his young audience. Christopher would sit in Ryan's lap by the fire, his small fingers tracing the pictures while his father's voice wove tales of adventure and wonder. "He's going to need schooling," Patricia had said one evening as they watched Christopher play with wooden blocks by the fireplace, his small hands already showing the dexterity that might one day make him a craftsman like his father. "There's no school up here, and I don't want him growing up ignorant of the wider world." "I can teach him," Ryan had replied without hesitation. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. I had a good education before I came west, and I've kept up with my studies. When he's older, if he wants more than we can give him here, we'll find a way to make it happen." The conversation had led to deeper discussions about their hopes and dreams for their son and for themselves. They had talked about expanding their homestead, perhaps taking in more children who needed homes, building something lasting that would endure long after they were gone and serve as a testament to the love that had brought them together. "I want him to have choices," Patricia had said, watching Christopher stack blocks with the intense concentration that characterized all his activities. "I want him to know that he can be anything he wants to be, go anywhere he wants to go. But I also want him to understand the value of this life we've built, to appreciate the beauty and freedom of this place." "He will," Ryan had assured her, his confidence based on his own experience of finding peace and purpose in the mountains. Children who grow up in places like this, they understand things that city children never learn. They know where their food comes from. They understand the cycles of nature. They learn to be self-reliant and resourceful. Those are gifts that will serve him well no matter where life takes him. It was during their third autumn together that Patricia had discovered she was pregnant again, the news filling them both with joy and anticipation that was tempered by the memory of Ryan's first wife and the very real dangers that childbirth could bring in their isolated location. But this time, they had been better prepared with more medical supplies, greater experience, and a stronger support network within their mountain community. Patricia had felt different during this pregnancy, more confident and secure than she had been while carrying Christopher. She was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who had fled Chicago in shame and terror. She was Patricia Myers, wife and mother, a woman who had proven herself capable of facing any challenge that life might present. The pregnancy had progressed smoothly, with none of the complications that had marked her first experience. She had continued working in the garden and around the homestead well into her 8th month, her body strong and healthy from years of mountain living and physical labor. When their daughter had been born in the spring, during a gentle rain that seemed to bless her arrival, the delivery had been smooth and uncomplicated. Linda had emerged into the world with a lusty cry that announced her presence to anyone within hearing distance, and from her first breath, she had been a force to be reckoned with. Linda had been born with Ryan's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, along with a spirit that seemed to embody the best qualities of both parents. Christopher had been fascinated by his baby sister, appointing himself her protector and helper in all things with the serious dedication that characterized his approach to everything he considered important. The sight of the two children playing together had filled Patricia's heart to overflowing, and she had often found herself marveling at the life she had built from the ashes of her former existence. The woman who had once believed herself ruined and worthless had created a family that was the envy of everyone who knew them. "Do you ever regret it?" Ryan had asked her one evening as they stood outside their cabin, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while the mountains stood sentinel around their little valley. "Leaving everything behind, coming to this wild place, taking a chance on a man you'd never met?" Patricia had considered the question seriously, thinking of the woman she had been when she first arrived at the trading post, frightened and alone and carrying another man's child. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a half-remembered dream that had little connection to her current reality. "Never," she had replied firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of absolute certainty. "This is where I was meant to be. These are the people I was meant to love. Everything that happened before, all the pain and fear and uncertainty, it was just the path that led me here." I wouldn't change a single step of the journey if it meant losing what we have now. Ryan had pulled her close, his lips brushing the top of her head in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. I love you, Patricia Myers. I loved you when you were scared and running from your past, and I love you now that you've found your strength. But most of all, I love the woman you've become through all of this. Their love had deepened and matured over the years, growing from desperate necessity into something rich and abiding that seemed to strengthen with each passing season. They had learned each other's rhythms and moods, had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, and had built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection that had surprised them both with its intensity. The homestead had prospered under their joint stewardship, expanding from Ryan's original modest cabin and garden into a thriving operation that supported not only their family, but contributed to the economic life of their mountain community. They had added rooms to the cabin, expanded their livestock operation, and established themselves as pillars of their small society. Patricia had become known throughout the region for her skill as a midwife and healer, her calm presence and practical knowledge making her the first person people called when medical emergencies arose. She had assisted at dozens of births, had nursed families through epidemics of influenza and other diseases, and had earned a reputation for competence and compassion that brought people to their door from miles around. Ryan's reputation as an honest dealer and skilled craftsman had brought them customers from as far away as Denver, men who valued quality work and fair dealing above the convenience of closer suppliers. His furniture was prized throughout the territory, and his knowledge of agriculture and animal husbandry made him a valuable consultant to other homesteaders. But perhaps their greatest achievement had been the family they had created together, a unit that seemed to embody all the best qualities of frontier life while maintaining the refinement and education that both parents valued. Christopher had grown into a bright, curious boy who loved books and learning, but was equally at home in the wilderness that surrounded their home, equally comfortable discussing literature and tracking deer through the forest. Linda had inherited her parents' determination and independence in full measure, and at 3 years old, she could already ride a horse, help with simple chores around the homestead, and express opinions on subjects that would have been considered inappropriate for children in more conventional settings. She was fearless and intelligent, with a quick wit and a stubborn streak that promised interesting challenges ahead. The challenges of mountain life had never disappeared entirely, serving as constant reminders that their prosperity and happiness existed at the sufferance of forces beyond their control. There had been harsh winters that tested their endurance and preparedness, with temperatures that dropped so low that merely venturing outside could be fatal without proper precautions. There had been droughts that threatened their crops and forced them to ration water carefully, and predators that posed constant danger to their livestock and sometimes to their family. One particularly difficult winter, when the snow had been so deep that they had been cut off from the outside world for 4 months, Patricia had fallen seriously ill with a fever that had left her delirious and weak. For days, she had drifted in and out of consciousness, while Ryan had nursed her through the worst of it, caring for her and the children with a tenderness that had brought tears to the eyes of their neighbors when they had finally been able to reach the homestead after the spring thaw. "I thought I was going to lose you," he had confessed when she had finally begun to recover, her fever breaking after nearly a week of crisis. "I couldn't bear the thought of facing this life without you, of raising the children alone." "You won't have to," Patricia had promised, her voice still weak but her resolve strong as ever. "We're bound together now, Ryan Myers. Nothing can separate us, not sickness, not hardship, not even death itself. What we've built together is stronger than any challenge we might face." The experience had reinforced their understanding of how precious and fragile their happiness was, and had strengthened their determination to make the most of every day they were given together. They had celebrated each milestone in their children's lives with special intensity, knowing that childhood was fleeting and that the time they had as a complete family was not guaranteed. They had also become more involved in their community's efforts to improve conditions for everyone in the region. Ryan had been elected to serve on the Territorial Council, using his position to advocate for better roads, improve mail service, and the establishment of schools that would serve the scattered homesteads and mining camps of their district. Patricia had organized the women of their area into a mutual aid society, a group that coordinated assistance for families facing crises and worked to improve medical care and educational opportunities for their children. The society had established a lending library, organized training sessions for midwives and healers, and created a network of communication that helped isolated families stay connected with their neighbors. As Christopher had approached his 10th birthday, he had begun to ask questions about his origins and his birth father. Questions that Patricia had been dreading but knew she would eventually have to answer. The boy was intelligent and observant, and he had begun to notice that he looked different from Ryan, that there were aspects of his family's story that didn't quite add up. Patricia had been unsure of how much truth a child could handle. But Ryan had encouraged her to be honest within reason, to give Christopher the information he needed to understand his place in their family without burdening him with details that might damage his sense of security and belonging. "He has a right to know where he came from," Ryan had said during one of their many discussions about the approaching conversation. "But he also has a right to know that biology doesn't determine family. Love does. Choice does. And every day since he was born, I've chosen to be his father." The conversation with Christopher had been difficult, but ultimately healing for all of them. Patricia had explained that his birth father had not been a good man, that she had come west to protect both of them from him, and that Ryan had chosen to accept them both into his life and heart without reservation. "So I'm not really a Myers?" Christopher had asked, his young face serious and thoughtful as he processed information that challenged everything he had believed about his identity. "You are absolutely a Myers," Ryan had replied firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of absolute truth. "Names are just words, son. What makes you my child is the love between us, the time we've spent together, the values I've tried to teach you. You're my son in every way that matters, and nothing will ever change that." The conversation had seemed to satisfy Christopher's curiosity and had actually brought the family closer together, creating a new level of honesty and openness that strengthened their bonds. He had begun to take pride in the story of his mother's courage and his father's generosity, understanding that their family had been forged through adversity and choice rather than mere accident of birth. Christopher had also begun to show more interest in his father's work, spending hours in Ryan's workshop learning to use tools and understanding the principles of craftsmanship that had made Ryan's reputation. The boy had natural ability and seemed to inherit his father's patience and attention to detail, qualities that served him well in his academic studies as well as practical pursuits. Linda had grown into a spirited child who seemed to fear nothing and nobody, approaching every challenge with the confidence of someone who had never been told that anything was impossible. She had inherited Patricia's determination and Ryan's quiet strength, combined with a mischievous streak that kept her parents on their toes and provided endless entertainment for her older brother. She could climb trees like a squirrel, swim in the mountain streams like a fish, and had already announced her intention to become a doctor when she grew up, a declaration that had initially surprised her parents, but which they had come to take seriously as they observed her natural aptitude for healing and her genuine compassion for those in need. "She's going to change the world," Patricia had said proudly one afternoon, watching her daughter attempt to bandage a wounded bird she had found in the forest, her small hands gentle but sure as she worked to help the injured creature. "Just like her mother did," Ryan had replied, his arms circling Patricia's waist as they stood together in the doorway of their home, watching their children play in the afternoon sunlight that painted everything in shades of gold. As their 10th wedding anniversary had approached, Patricia had found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point, the incredible transformation that had taken her from desperate flight to profound contentment. The frightened, desperate woman who had arrived at the trading post seemed like someone from another lifetime, and in many ways she was. That woman had died during the siege of their cabin, and in her place had emerged someone stronger, more confident, more certain of her place in the world and her ability to face whatever challenges life might present. The metamorphosis had been gradual but complete, like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis to discover powers it had never imagined possessing. The anniversary celebration had been simple but meaningful, attended by friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years, and who had witnessed the transformation of two strangers into a couple whose love had become legendary in their small community. Scott Alvarez, now an old man, but still sharp as a tack and still running the trading post with the same efficiency that had characterized his younger years, had raised a toast to the couple who had proven that love could triumph over any obstacle with enough determination and mutual support. "I've seen a lot of mail-order marriages in my time," he had said, his weathered face creased with smiles as he looked around the room at the assembled guests. "Some work out, some don't. But I've never seen two people who are more meant for each other than Ryan and Patricia. They didn't just find love, they built it, day by day, choice by choice, challenge by challenge." The words had resonated deeply with Patricia, capturing the essence of what their marriage had become over the years. It hadn't been a fairy tale romance with instant attraction and effortless happiness, but rather a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering commitment to each other and their family. As the evening had wound down and their guests had departed for their own homes, Patricia and Ryan had sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, while the sounds of the wilderness surrounded them with the familiar symphony that had become the soundtrack of their life together. "Any regrets?" Ryan had asked, echoing the question he had posed years earlier, though now it seemed more like a ritual than a genuine inquiry. Patricia had smiled, thinking of all the paths her life might have taken, all the different choices she could have made, all the ways things could have gone wrong instead of so wonderfully right. "Only one," she had replied, her voice soft with contentment. "What's that?" "I wish I could go back and tell that scared young woman on the train that everything was going to be all right, that she was heading toward the best life she could possibly imagine, toward love and family and a home that would exceed her wildest dreams." The years that followed had brought new challenges and new joys in equal measure, each season adding new layers to the rich tapestry of their life together. Christopher had grown into a thoughtful young man with his mother's compassion and his father's steady strength, along with an intellectual curiosity that seemed to encompass everything from engineering to literature to natural philosophy. He had excelled in his studies under Ryan's tutelage, mastering not only the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but delving deep into subjects that would have challenged students in the finest Eastern academies. Ryan's extensive library and his own broad education had provided Christopher with opportunities that few frontier children ever received. When he had turned 16, Christopher had announced his intention to attend college in Denver, with the ultimate goal of becoming a civil engineer and contributing to the development of the Western Territories. The decision had been bittersweet for his parents, who were proud of his ambitions and wanted him to have every opportunity to succeed, but who also dreaded the thought of him leaving their mountain sanctuary. "He needs to see the world beyond these mountains," Ryan had said, as they discussed Christopher's future during one of their evening conversations by the fire. "We've given him roots, strong ones that will anchor him no matter where he goes. But now he needs wings to explore what lies beyond our valley." Patricia had agreed, though her heart had ached at the thought of her son venturing into the same world she had once fled in terror and desperation. But Christopher was not the frightened, vulnerable woman she had been. He was strong and confident, armed with the values and love his parents had instilled in him, prepared to face whatever challenges the wider world might present. The discussions about Christopher's future had led to broader conversations about education and opportunity, and Patricia and Ryan had begun working with other families in their region to establish a proper school that could serve all the children of their mountain community. They had pooled their resources to hire a qualified teacher and build a schoolhouse that would ensure future generations would have access to education without having to leave their families. Linda, now 13 and every bit as determined as her parents had predicted, had announced her own plans to follow in her brother's footsteps, though her goal was medical school rather than engineering. She had been assisting Patricia with her midwifery work for several years, showing a natural aptitude for healing and a genuine compassion for those in need that suggested she had found her true calling. "I want to be a real doctor," she had declared with the confidence that characterized all her pronouncements. "Not just someone who knows folk remedies and common sense, though those are important too. I want to learn everything there is to know about medicine so I can help people the way you've helped our neighbors all these years, but with better tools and more knowledge. The prospect of both children leaving for their education had forced Patricia and Ryan to confront the reality that their active parenting years were drawing to a close, that the cabin that had once echoed with the sounds of children's laughter would soon be quiet except for their own voices. But rather than filling them with dread, the prospect had seemed to open new possibilities for their own lives. They had begun to talk about traveling, perhaps visiting the children in Denver during their studies, or even taking a trip back east to see some of the places Patricia had only read about in books, but had never had the opportunity to experience. "We could see the ocean," Patricia had said dreamily during one such conversation, her eyes distant with imagination. "I've always wondered what it would be like to stand at the edge of the continent and look out at all that water stretching to the horizon." "Then we'll go," Ryan had promised without hesitation. "When the children are settled in their studies and we can leave the homestead in good hands, we'll take that trip. It's time we had some adventures of our own." The conversation had reminded Patricia of how much she had changed since her arrival in Montana, how the woman who had once been too frightened to venture beyond the familiar confines of her neighborhood was now eager to explore the world with the man she loved. The transformation had been so gradual that she had barely noticed it happening, but the evidence was undeniable. As Christopher had prepared to leave for college, the family had gathered for one last evening together before his departure, an occasion that was both celebration and farewell. They had shared stories and memories, laughed over old photographs that documented their family's growth and adventures, and made plans for his return visits that would help maintain their connection despite the distance. But underlying the celebration had been the bittersweet knowledge that their family dynamic was changing forever, that Christopher's departure marked the end of one chapter in their lives and the beginning of another. The little boy who had played with wooden blocks by their fireplace was becoming a man with his own dreams and ambitions. "I'm proud of you," Patricia had told her son as they sat together on the porch after the others had gone to bed, sharing a quiet moment under the stars that had witnessed so much of their family's history. "Not just because of your academic achievements, but because of the man you have become. You're kind and honorable and strong, and I know you'll make a difference in the world." Christopher had hugged her tightly, his voice thick with emotion that he was still learning to express. "I learned from the best. You and Dad showed me what it means to face adversity with courage, to build something beautiful out of difficult circumstances. I'll carry those lessons with me wherever I go." The next morning, as they had watched the stagecoach carry Christopher away toward his future, Patricia had felt a complex mixture of pride and loss that seemed to embody the contradictions of parenthood. Her son was beginning his own journey into the world, armed with the love and values his parents had given him, but ready to make his own choices and face his own challenges. "He'll be fine," Ryan had said, his arm around her shoulders as the stagecoach disappeared around a bend in the mountain road, carrying their son toward adventures they could only imagine. "We raised him right. He knows who he is and where he comes from." Linda had remained at home for 2 more years, growing increasingly mature and responsible as she helped her parents with the daily work of the homestead while continuing her own education and medical training. But Patricia could see the restlessness in her daughter's eyes, the same hunger for knowledge and experience that had driven Christopher to seek his education in the wider world. When Linda's time had come to leave for her own studies, the parting had been no less difficult despite their preparation for it. She had chosen to attend a women's medical college in Philadelphia, a decision that had required tremendous courage and determination, given the obstacles that women faced in the medical profession. "I'm not afraid," Linda had declared as she packed her belongings with the same methodical precision that characterized everything she did. "You taught me that fear is just another obstacle to overcome. I know what I want, and I'm going to get it, no matter what anyone says about women not belonging in medicine." Patricia had marveled at her daughter's confidence, remembering her own terror and uncertainty at the same age. Linda was venturing into a world that would test her in ways Patricia could barely imagine, but she was doing so with her head held high and her goals clearly in sight. With both children away at school, Patricia and Ryan had entered a new phase of their marriage, rediscovering each other as individuals rather than just parents. The quiet cabin that had once seemed too small for their growing family now felt spacious and peaceful. filled with the comfortable silence of two people who had learned to appreciate each other's company without need for constant conversation. They had rediscovered the simple pleasure of each other's company, sharing meals without interruption from children's chatter, and spending long evenings reading together by the fire or simply sitting in comfortable silence. The intimacy that had been interrupted by years of child-rearing had returned, deeper and richer for the experiences they had shared. They had also begun to take on new roles in their community, using their experience and wisdom to help younger families navigate the challenges of mountain life. Ryan had been elected to the territorial legislature, using his position to advocate for better roads and schools in the mountain regions, while Patricia had expanded her medical practice to include training programs for aspiring midwives and healers. The letters from their children had brought regular updates on their progress and adventures, each one a source of pride and joy that helped ease the loneliness of their absence. Christopher had excelled in his engineering studies and had already been offered a position with a railroad company upon his graduation, while Linda had faced the expected prejudice and discrimination in medical school, but had persevered with the same determination that had characterized her childhood. They're both doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, Patricia had said as she read Linda's latest letter aloud, sharing news of her daughter's success in a particularly challenging anatomy course. Following their dreams, making their own way in the world, building on the foundation we gave them. Just like their mother did, Ryan had replied, smiling at her across the breakfast table where they had shared so many conversations over the years. You came here with nothing but courage and hope, and look what you built. Patricia had considered his words, thinking about the journey that had brought her from that desperate flight from Chicago to this moment of contentment and fulfillment. We built it, she had corrected gently, reaching across the table to take his hand. None of this would have been possible without you, without your willingness to take a chance on a stranger. As they had approached their 15th wedding anniversary, Patricia had found herself thinking more and more about the legacy they were leaving behind, the impact their love had made not just on their own lives, but on their community and their children. Their story had become something of a legend in their region, proof that love could triumph over any obstacle with enough determination and mutual support. The anniversary celebration had been a grand affair, with friends and neighbors traveling from miles around to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. The story of the mail-order bride who had arrived pregnant and found not just acceptance but love had been told and retold until it had taken on the quality of a fairy tale, inspiring other couples facing their own challenges. But Patricia knew the truth was both simpler and more complex than the story suggested. Love hadn't conquered all through magic or destiny or any of the romantic notions that people preferred to believe. It had triumphed through daily choices, through commitment renewed again and again, through the decision to build something beautiful together regardless of the obstacles they faced. As the evening had wound down and their guests had departed for their own homes, Patricia and Ryan had walked hand in hand to the edge of their property, looking out over the valley that had been their home for so many years. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, and the stars shone with the same brilliance that had welcomed Patricia on her first night in this wilderness sanctuary. "Do you think we did it right?" Patricia had asked, her voice soft in the mountain stillness that had become as familiar as breathing. "This life we built together, the choices we made, the way we raised our children, the example we set for our community?" Ryan had been quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to all important matters, weighing his words carefully before speaking. "I think we did the best we could with what we had," he had said finally. "We loved each other, we loved our children, we served our community, we faced every challenge together and never gave up on each other or on the life we were building. What more could anyone ask for?" Patricia had smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her heart like a benediction, like the final piece of a puzzle that had taken years to complete. They had indeed done the best they could, and it had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything she had never dared to dream of when she had stepped off that stagecoach so many years ago. As they had walked back toward their cabin, their home glowing warmly in the darkness like a beacon of love and security, Patricia had felt a deep sense of completion and gratitude that seemed to encompass her entire existence. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 15 years ago had found exactly what she had been searching for, even though she hadn't known what that was at the time. She had found love, but more than that, she had found herself. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, purpose that gave meaning to every day, and a sense of belonging that had transformed her from a refugee into a pioneer, from a victim into a survivor, from a stranger into the heart of a family and a community. The mail-order bride had become a mountain woman, and in doing so had found her true home at last. The wind whispered through the pines as they reached their door, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as they always had. And that, Patricia knew with absolute certainty, was the greatest blessing of all.